Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Um, we are going to continue on into modules 30 through 36. We're going to take a look at inflation, unemployment, and stabilization policies. Talk about monetary and fiscal policies, and look at some long run things as we carry on. We've learned about the basic money market and loanable funds in the last unit and talked about the three different monetary policies of reserve requirement, discount rate, and the open market. The unit before that, we talked about fiscal policies of increasing or decreasing taxes or increasing or decreasing government spending. And then we even talked about, before that, we talked about the uh, ideas of investment when we think of um, the aggregate demand curve being C plus I plus G plus net exports. We talked about consumption, the C part, and the multiplier effect of one divided by the marginal propensity to save. Then we looked at the tax multiplier, which is marginal propensity to consume divided by the marginal propensity to save. So we've gone through a lot of that stuff already, and we're going to continue on with that material. So when we put the fiscal and monetary policies together, as we talked about a little bit, um, we have to think that the policymakers have to work together when we think of fiscal policies and we think of Congress and what they're doing with taxes and spending. But also, we have to think about the Federal Reserve, what they have to do. So, suppose there's already a positive output gap and the government increases spending. Well, what would the central bank do to prevent more inflation or to keep interest rates stable? So, if we already have a positive gap because of things that are happening in the economy, how do we kind of slow those things down in a sense to make sure that things don't get too carried away? And so we're constantly doing this back and forth, back and forth. So, we know the central bank could lower the money supply by selling bonds. They could raise the reserve requirement. They could raise the discount rate. So, where the fiscal policies might be loose or expansionary, we might see some monetary policies that are tight or contractionary. Or in different parts, they might, we might raise taxes somewhere or lower taxes in another economic group. Spending in certain states, less spending in other states. So it's a matter of a balancing act. So here, if we have a negative output gap, meaning that this is our potential, the long run aggregate supply curve is our potential, and we're in a recessionary gap. Okay, we're in a recessionary gap, and the goal is to close that gap. We have higher unemployment than we expect. We are at the trough part of our business cycle. So then we want the aggregate demand curve to shift right now. If we practice laissez-faire approach, and we left this back like this, laissez-faire approach would tell us that the short run aggregate supply curve, because people are unemployed, people are willing to take lower wages, that would shift us to here with the short run aggregate supply curve and the price levels would fall. But we know that we want the government, and that could take a really long time. So we want the government, through combinations of fiscal and monetary policies, to close that gap rather than practicing laissez-faire approaches. So that's typically what we're going to see, something that causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. So when we think of this combination of fiscal policies and monetary policies, what would happen to the following things here in the short run because we want to close this gap? So if we're trying to do a combination of things, combination of expansionary policies, both with maybe cutting taxes, not only cutting taxes, we could improve government spending, we could possibly do some sort of monetary policy of lowering the discount rate, lowering the reserve requirement, or buying in the open market. So if we did any combination of those five things to expand the aggregate demand curve to the right, things that could happen. Well, we could increase the money supply, right, by doing any of those three monetary policies I said, buying the open market, lowering the discount rate, or lowering the reserve requirement. Well, if we increase the money supply, then we're going to decrease the interest rates by doing that, because essentially our money supply curve will shift to the right, which lowers the nominal interest rates. Then we're going to see by possibly lowering the interest rates, banks will borrow more money, and by borrowing more money, people will buy things, which will cause the price level to go up, right? Which then essentially our real output would go up because we're shifting to the right. And in theory, what should happen to unemployment? Unemployment should fall. Now, the next thing comes in with the whole idea of budget surplus and national debt. Well, our budget surplus would fall because we're spending, if we're doing a fiscal policy where we're spending more money, then essentially our budget surplus or added money would diminish. And then essentially our national debt, if we're deficit spending, will increase. So a series of these things happen when we do combinations of monetary and fiscal policies. Okay, so we're going to take a look at those. Here, if a reduction in aggregate supply is followed by an increase in aggregate demand, which of the following will definitely occur? So, which will definitely occur? So, a reduction in aggregate supply, so aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply shifts left, and an increase in aggregate demand curve. What will we know absolutely positively will occur? The price level will increase. Now, output technically could be ambiguous. We're not really sure on output, but we know price levels will go up. Which of the following combination of fiscal and monetary policies will correct a severe recession? Which will affect a severe recession. So we're talking about expansionary policies of expansionary monetary and expansionary fiscal policies. What do we know will help us in a severe recession? It means we have huge amounts of unemployment and we have this huge recessionary gap. That would be D, decreasing income tax rates, which is decreasing taxes is a expansionary fiscal policy, and increasing the money supply, which would be caused by whether we buy in the open market, or we decrease discount rate, or we decrease the reserve requirement. Those two things would cause us to get the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Which of the following monetary and fiscal policies will reduce unemployment? So getting more people to work, buying government bonds, in the open market, or decreasing taxes, which is this is essentially the same type of question from the page before. Okay. So putting it all together, there's a short video on the webpage about putting these things together if you want to take a look at it. So Unit 6 is essentially about inflation, unemployment, and stabilization policies. Okay. And we're going to take a look at Module 30, which is long-run implications of fiscal policies. We're talking about deficits and the public debt. So essentially, when we talk about fiscal policies, and if we increase government spending and cut taxes at the same time, what essentially happens? We create that public debt, and we've talked about that crowding out phase with deficit spending. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a look at that. So we're going to explain why the government needs to calculate the cyclical adjustments of our balanced budget, or our budget balance. We need to identify some problems with public debt, and what happens, if we have a long-term, like right now, our debt is what, 22, 23, 24 trillion dollars, and it's going up really, really fast. So when we look at the basic idea of having a budget balance. We have to look at the amount of tax revenue that our government takes in, minus the government spending, minus any kind of transfer payments. And we've talked about in a closed society, the amount of saving and revenue should be essentially, what we have left over is what we're going to save. So the amount of government savings would be the taxes we create minus the spending and the transfer payments. Now, in this, once again, we're looking at uh, our fiscal policies. And remember, our fiscal policies, we raise taxes, we spend, and any kind of those transfer payments, and whatever's left over is what the government would save. So this, if there's more government spend or saving, that would shift the supply curve for loanable funds up. Okay. Now, we want to make sure that we try to have a balanced budget. That's the goal. We don't want to have this huge deficit spending, but it happens. We've become very accustomed to having deficit spending. Okay. Now, once again, we've talked about before where we have expansionary and contractionary policies. And when we talked about expansionary policies, um, when we say expansionary policies, our budget surplus it makes our budget surplus smaller or our budget deficit larger because expansionary policies means we're cutting taxes, right, and we're increasing spending. So here we're decreasing our taxes and we're increasing government spending. Well, that's sort of like if we work less hours and make less money, but we spend more, which is not, that puts us in debt. Contractionary policies do the exact opposite. The contractionary policies we know will increase our tax revenue, our government's tax revenue, and decrease government spending. So smaller government purchases of goods and services, smaller government transfers, but higher taxes. So that would either, make our budget surplus bigger or our budget deficit smaller. Okay. And there are a lot of different politicians that believe in more contractionary policies. If we truly wanted to get rid of our $24 trillion in debt, that's the policy, more something we'd have to go to. We'd have to cut spending. Now, we have these fluctuations, and because of our business cycle, right? Because of the business cycle, when we are down here, we will tend to have expansionary policies, and up here, we tend to have contractionary policies. Okay. But we're trying to adjust our budgets consistently back and forth to try to get us closer to this line of, let's say, full employment or our long run aggregate supply curve at our full potential. We're trying to lessen the volatility and get this a little closer and this a little closer to here. So we're constantly jumping back and forth, jumping back and forth. Okay. So should the budget be balanced? And I bring this up several times in this lesson. Budget deficits can cause problems for both the government and the economy, but politicians are tempted to run deficits because it allows them to cater to voters, because voters love having their taxes cut at the same time increasing some sort of government spending. But that creates greater deficit. Presidents always talk about, or politicians always talk about cutting taxes, but yet they always talk about increasing spending. Those things don't match. If you're cutting spending and you're if you're cutting taxes and increasing spending, you're creating a larger and larger deficit. Okay. So if we take a look here at this graph, we can see this graph right here shows us the U.S. federal budget deficit and the business cycle. Okay. And you can see here that our business cycle goes up and down, and then we see deficit spending increasing. So we can see our business cycle here. We see that the budget deficit is a percentage of our GDP tends to raise during a recession, which is that shaded area, and then fall during expansionary times. Okay, so that is something that we're always constantly trying to balance. Here we see here we see the unemployment rate and our budget deficit. And you can see here as unemployment rates go up, what happens? Our budget deficit goes up. So we are doing expansionary policies to try to combat the the unemployment. And then when unemployment falls really low, then what do? Our budget deficit goes negative, so we have surplus. So this is this constant cycle. So we see our budget deficit, how much our government is spending or going into debt to try to combat those time periods of high unemployment. So there's a really close relationship between the balanced budget and the business cycle. A recession moves the budget balance toward, or the recession moves the budget balance towards deficits, but an expansionary moves it towards a surplus. So we see this back and forth throughout time. And you can see different times in different time periods. We know in 2000 and uh, in 2008 9 we had this huge unemployment rate. So what do? We deficit spend to increase that. Okay. So here, this is once again showing us the actual budget deficit versus our cyclical adjusted budget deficit. Now, this cyclical adjusted balanced budget is an estimate of what the budget balance would be if real GDP were exactly equal to potential output. So, if our real GDP at the current time was at our exact potential, and you could see once again that the cyclical adjustments of our budget deficit is an estimate, right? And it's moving back and forth. Once again, trying to balance the business cycle. Okay. So what we see is most economists, like we said before, don't believe the government should be forced to run a balanced budget every year, right? We talk about having a balanced budget, but some years are better than others. So some years we will see that we will be in a greater, we will be more of a deficit spending one year versus another year. Um, but we are concerned about that excessive deficit. And we're going to have to do things to protect from these extensive deficits. Okay, are they necessary? Are deficits a necessary thing? So once again, as a result, because we talk about before I wrote, this is the same thing I have earlier about the deficit spending. We like to cater to voters. There are occasional attempts by policymakers to force fiscal discipline, right? You have libertarians, and you have some both on the conservative and liberal sides that are more moderate that tend to um, force more discipline. For example, some will say if the government only brings in $1 trillion of tax revenue, they should only spend $1 trillion, and they try to have more of a balanced budget. Um, but once again, other economists will argue as long as the average, over a series of years throughout a cycle, if it becomes balanced through a cycle, that's okay. Okay, so if we have a surplus during inflationary times and a deficit during recessionary times, if there's a balance, okay, through the business cycle. So if we think of the business cycle being this up and down here, that when we're down here, we have a budget deficit, and then up here, we have a budget surplus, that over time it will balance itself out. So, what is considered a fiscal year? And our fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30, which is a calendar year. So, a lot of times you'll see a lot of government spending will start to slow down in the month of September because they're waiting to October 1st because they'll Congress will vote on a balanced budget in September towards the end of September for October 1st. Okay, that's usually what you see happen. So the one thing about having public debt, having that government debt is that crowding out idea that we're always so concerned with. Remember, when the government takes out more loans, then that pushes the demand for loanable funds to the right, raising the interest rates, which then crowds out your local businesses. Businesses don't want to then borrow at the higher interest rate to invest in their company, and then even yourself may be less likely to borrow money to, let's say, buy a house or buy a car, something that you have to borrow a substantial amount of money in at the higher interest rate. Now, we can't just print money to pay off our bills because what happens? We get huge inflation just to pay off our bills like that. That's not a good thing. Okay. So, what we tend to do is um, we try to look at our debt to GDP ratio, the government's debt as a percentage of our GDP. And we try to look at that for the long term. The numbers essentially remain stable or fall, with moderate budget deficits. It stays pretty consistent. And there's a couple graphs that I have that show that. So if we look at the federal budget deficit since 1940, you can see in 1940 because of deficit spending because of World War II. But then you could see we're relatively close. Our budget deficit's a little bit high of our GDP, but it stays relatively close over the longevity of our country. And that's what we're saying where we get those surpluses and shortages coinciding with our typical business cycle. Here is the actual ratio, and you can see it's a little bit higher. It's a little bit higher when we look at this. But once again, when we compare these two, we're staying relatively low here. We went a little high here because of the 2008, 9, 10 recession. And once again, that's kind of a normal thing. Now, when you look at other countries, you look at the uh, Japan's deficit spending, and you look at their debt to GDP ratio. Huge difference here. Panel A shows for Japan. Panel A shows the budget deficit of Japan as a percentage of the GDP, where B shows the debt to GDP ratio. A large deficits that the Japan government began running in the early 90s have led to a rapid raise in their debt to GDP ratio as their debt has grown very quickly. This has led some economists, some analysis to express huge concerns about the long run fiscal health of their economy because way too much of their debt is a huge percentage of their GDP, and what's going to happen in the long term. So when we think of government deficits and national debt, that is something we have to be very concerned with. There are trade-offs. Increasing government spending without raising taxes, yeah, to close a recessionary gap. Well, that'll happen, but we get deficit spending, right? And we have to look at our budget deficit, how much are we spending versus our tax revenue, budget surplus. This is usually happens when we're in an inflationary time where our spending might fall down and our tax revenue is a little bit higher. And then we can see over time the national debt is the debt that we're accruing over time. Um, when Obama took office, we were at roughly 8 or 9 trillion in debt. When he left office, we were like $19 trillion in debt. But we had the war on terror. We had the we were in two different wars essentially during that time, and we also had the housing market crash. So we were at a time period where, with the recessionary spending, it dramatically went up in our deficit spending, I should say. Okay. So if the government increases spending without increasing taxes, we will have this national debt developing. There's also a video that corresponds with that. So if you want to take a look at that, that would be just looking at the debt clock. I believe I have a link to the debt clock here somewhere. But as you could see here, you could see the countries in red have the highest debt to GDP ratio, and in the green, you see the lowest debt to GDP ratio. Okay. So here, if we take a look, if I click here and it takes us right to it, you could see here we're right now at 24 trillion of our U.S. national debt per person. Meaning debt per citizen is currently $74,000. Right, the average revenue that is gained, tax revenue by citizens per year is just at 10,500, and you can see how fast our debt is climbing. All right, so you could take a look at this. Oops. You could take a look at this throughout and see how much of our deficit is growing. All right. And this is like nonstop growing. I mean, it's pretty crazy here. Okay. So once again, you could see over time, our deficit spending has dramatically increased. Now, being with the coronavirus and things like that, you're definitely going to see a change in the deficit spending because of everything that's going on right now. But once again, we were hoping, our projected here, we were hoping not to be in that much debt compared to our GDP. But unfortunately, right now, because of our crisis that is happening, the pandemic, we're going to see a lot of spending by our government. So when we think of things in general, when we think of the government, we had to pay off our World War II debt, right? Um, and it took us quite a bit of time to get us to pay off our debt. This is something that we have to really be concerned with. Is this $24 trillion in debt ever going to disappear? Okay. Now, some of the impacts of these debts, okay, these liabilities are spending promises made. When we think about our implicit liabilities, these are spending promises that we promise to do. That that are made by our government that are effectively a debt, uh, despite the fact that we are not including them in our debt payments. So things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, benefits for low-income families. The unfortunate thing is these debts, because people are living longer, because people are living longer, um, these debts are getting to be these liabilities are getting bigger and bigger and bigger over time, and you can see the projections. Um, and when we think of Social Security, well, Social Security is our money that the government holds on to, but you would think these would be going up also because people are contributing to them, but they're not contributing at a greater and greater percentage. But here, because people are living longer, you can start collecting Social Security at 70 and people are living till 80 and 90. Our Medicare and Medicaid payments from our government are going to get exponentially large. Okay. So when we think about, once again, having a balanced budget, okay, we have to look at our fiscal policies, right? If we want to have, if you know, if we want to control our budget, we're going to have to raise taxes and cut spending. But what politician would ever want to run on a platform of raising taxes and cutting spending? That whether it's a president or a congressman or a governor or a mayor, nobody would vote for a politician that says, "I want to take more from your paycheck and give you less," in the sense of government spending. So that just just won't happen. But that's the only way we can get rid of this huge national debt. Okay. And we want to continue to look at the crowding out issue. As we continue to deficit spend, we have that crowding out, which discourages people from borrowing because it deficit spending and our government borrowing money causes the demand for loanable funds to go up, which causes the real interest rate to go up. We would like to keep our debt to GDP ratio stable, but once again, there are times that it goes up and there's times that it goes down. And typically we see, deficit spending rising during recessionary times and then deficit surplus during inflationary times to affect that. So that is module 30. Hopefully, today is going to be a good day for you. Look forward to seeing you guys, and we'll talk to you later. All right. Have a great day.